Hello and welcome to our first TORQ podcast. My name's Matt. I'm the owner of TORQ. I'm a sports scientist. Next to me to my right is Cav. He's a sports scientist and performance practitioner. And we've got our special guest today, Dan, who's a professional triathlete and coach. And the subject we're going to be talking about is fueling your marathon training, and we'll also cover fueling your marathon as well. And the reason Dan's with us is because he is an Ironman triathlete, which is a much bigger deal than running a marathon alone. So fueling is absolutely critical, but he obviously has the marathon experience, and Cav and myself are cyclists, so we're from the dark side. So, we feel that we need to have somebody who is very experienced in marathon running to help us with this conversation. So we've got a lot to talk about, but what we thought we'd kick off with, Dan, is just to ask you a question. I think Cav and I will have our opinions on it as well. Have you ever hit the wall?
Yeah, I think definitely 100%. And I think if you haven't hit the wall, you haven't really done the racing right. You need to get to that point where you're pushing your sort of body to the limit, and you've got to find out that end limit. And so hitting the wall is sort of an inevitable
part of it
when you're new into the sport as well, and you don't know how the nutrition and everything works. Inevitably, at some point, you're going to hit the wall.
So would you say, from my perspective, I hit the wall before I really knew what I was doing? I can proudly say that probably for 30 years I haven't done, and I think that's probably why TORQ was developed, because I discovered what a difference fueling with carbohydrate makes. But Cav, you must have hit the wall as well at some point, or in cycling we call it bonking, don't we, for some reason?
Terminology is slightly different, and some of the older people in the audience might raise an eyebrow at that terminology. But yeah, I definitely have. I must say, I've grown up in sport since about the age of 12, and education is not at the forefront of your mind when you're that old. So when you're going on a jolly with all the local cycling club who say, let's do 5 hours, and you're a 12-year-old child who doesn't understand fueling, I can say I've bonked a lot more than once.
And so Dan, can you describe the sensation? Can you describe the sensation of what hitting the wall or bonking feels like?
I think it's just along the lines of, like, mentally you want to push as hard as you can, but physically your body cannot do anything. And as soon as you try, I mean, I'd say for me the biggest time that I hit the wall was when I did Ironman Wales 3 years ago. What didn't help is it's like a super hot day. So obviously, like, nutrition, when it's a super hot day, nutrition is even more important. And you're pushing through, and then all of a sudden you physically cannot go anywhere, even though mentally you're like, okay, let's just keep going, and you just slow until you get to the point where it's just a war of attrition to just get to the finish line, really.
Have you ever had it where I've not had it where I've actually kind of lost my mind?
No, I've never.
I've had a catastrophic loss of power, I would describe.
Yeah, I've never got to that point where, as an example, where Johnny Brownlee a couple of years ago, where you're literally like deteriorating and starting to collapse and that sort of thing. But you're sort of, I think your brain's at a point where it sort of obviously knows when you've not got enough energy to be able to keep going, and therefore it will consciously tell you to slow down. And then, I must have walked 50% of that marathon just to get to the finish line.
You want to run, but you can't.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say, like I said, I've hit the wall a fair few times, and my sport's predominantly cycling, and I've got to the point a few times where my brain is telling me that it would actually be easier to get off and push my bike the whole way home rather than ride, and that is completely illogical. Obviously, cycling's one of the most efficient modes of transport.
Do you not think it's like bonking when you're running is obviously dangerous, but bonking, like hitting the wall, totally is a dangerous thing to do? But when you're like on a bike and moving at a fairly decent speed, and you've got to actually control this bike as well, it's got to be surely a lot more dangerous to be able to bonk during cycling than it actually is potentially during running.
Might be safer to walk.
Yeah, definitely. Like you referenced Johnny Brownlee, I've personally never been that extreme, and I've only seen it a handful of times ever been that extreme. But yeah, if you're in that state on a bike, I'd advise definitely sitting in a bush and getting some food down you.
Right, so we've had a good description of what hitting the wall or bonking is. So fundamentally, what it is, it's when your body runs out of carbohydrate and you can only store so much. And if you fuel insufficiently or don't fuel at all, then your carbohydrate stores run out and runs out and your metabolism grinds to a halt. That's a pretty brief assessment of it. So what we're planning on talking about today then is having described what can happen, we want to talk to you about not only avoiding that, but how you can get your nutrition right for your marathon training so that not only do you not hit the dreaded wall during any of your sessions and during the competition, but also how you can fuel your body outside of exercise to get stronger, to adapt and be at its strongest on race day. So that's the fundamentals of what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about, first of all, the three main macronutrients. So we're talking about carbohydrate, protein and fat. I mean, I can ask the question, if anyone wants to answer it, is what is carbohydrate? Does anybody want to have a...
You're the best person to answer this.
You say, Dan, do you want to give us...
I don't know the answer to that. I just know that I need to take them on board.
Right, so this sports science will cover the carbohydrate question.
So there is a lot of information around carbohydrates. Some of it will not necessarily be as relevant to performance athletes. And in my mind, in a performance setting, when someone asks me what a carbohydrate is, they're referring to the foods they're going to focus on eating, and then maybe for someone that's more educated would be referring to glucose and fructose in this manner. So as a very quick summary, we have two ways of getting carbohydrate into our system in a performance manner, and that is glucose and fructose. And in a food sense, some carbohydrate-rich meals or foods would be rice, potatoes, pasta, sweets, and for those of us who are just trying to shovel it in, sometimes as simple as sugar.
Yeah. I think, just to add to that, you've got, you've basically, as Cav has said, you've got things like pasta, rice, potatoes. They tend to carry fibre. They tend to carry other good nutrients. So they should be the mainstay of an endurance athlete's diet. But sometimes when training volumes are high, it is easier to get the carbs in through sugars. Yeah. If you try to get all your carbs in through the really healthy sources, you could be at a negative energy balance. For instance, a piece of toast, a thick piece of wholemeal bread, if you put a thin bit of honey on it, you've doubled the carb content. Yeah. And actually it makes the bread a little bit easier to eat as well. So carbs, basically, they come as either monosaccharides and disaccharides, which are sugars, or polysaccharides, which tend to be starches. But as Cav says, they're all broken down to glucose ultimately. Even fructose is broken down to glucose in the liver. So that is a little bit on carbohydrate. So the next question we're going to ask is, this is a really good one, I think, for Cav to cover, which is how fuel utilization changes with intensity and with duration. So we burn fat and we burn carbs and we burn some protein, but
Yeah, so just to quickly summarize, when we're discussing fuel utilization, it is the proportion of fat and carbohydrate as a percentage that we're using. So say like when we're walking around, it'll be predominantly fat, and at the most extreme end, so when we're going all out, it'll be predominantly carbohydrate. And there is a crossover point where carbohydrate becomes our predominant fuel source, and that is around 70% of MAP, I believe. That's
70% of your best.
Yeah.
We say to them.
Yeah. So that's when carbohydrate becomes a predominant fuel source. So as explained, with intensity, your carbohydrate utilization goes up. So we'll be burning more, so we'll require more fuel. And the longer we exercise, our body fatigues and it becomes less efficient. This will also increase the amount of carbohydrate that we'll be using compared to fat. If there's anything else you'd like to add, or Dan, you got any questions on that topic?
No, I think you explained it really well. Like up to sort of you're working at that 70% is where you're using your fat stores, and then as soon as you get to that above that 70%, you're into solely carbohydrates. So yeah, it's one of them where you've obviously got stored fats and stored carbohydrates in your body from what you've taken, your diet basically. So, but then obviously it's really important when you are working at quite a high intensity to make sure you're replenishing them carbohydrate stores as much as you can, and that's where obviously fueling is a big part of it.
Yeah, so I mean, the bottom line is, however lean you are as a professional triathlete, you have abundant fat stores, so you're never going to run out of fat. We store it under our skin, so that's not going to be an issue. But we do have a limited supply of carbohydrate, which is around about 500 grams or 2,000 calories, plus or minus. And obviously, the higher intensity you push, which if you're racing and you want to get your best performance, as Cav has explained, you're going to burn more carbohydrates. So if you've only got 500 grams of carbohydrate stored, what happens when it runs out? We go back to the start and we hit the dreaded wall. You do need carbohydrate. So the storage of and this is called endogenous stores of carbohydrate. So something we're going to get onto when we talk about fueling a little bit. The carbohydrate you take on board when you're fueling with gels or various sort of high carbohydrate items is called exogenous. So it's an exogenous form of carbohydrate. So we're going to talk about those in a bit. It's a TORQ motto, is eat today for tomorrow. I don't know if you fancy explaining that, Cav. And, Dan, you could possibly infill with what that kind of means.
Yeah.
So we've just covered storing carbohydrate, like we said, 500 grams. And if we're eating today for tomorrow, a big part of making sure we're successful in our training or event day is making sure that our carbohydrate stores are full before we go into this event. And it takes time to do that. The body can only digest so much carbohydrate at a time. And if we're going into an event with these stores empty, obviously that's not great. And that sort of top-up process of our carbohydrate stores happens the day before. So say if you do 2 days of training in a row or a pre-race or pre-event activation, what you'll have done during that training session or that prep is deplete some of your carbohydrate stores, and after that we're really looking to top them up ahead of the next session. So as we say, eat today for tomorrow. You want to be making sure you're topping up those those stores immediately after the session through fueling, and like I say, that'll happen 12 to 24 hours before the event you're targeting, and obviously that is the day before the key event.
And the only thing I'll add to that, I don't want to jump the gun, but also the eating today for tomorrow does include what you consume while you're exercising, because you're constantly protecting your stores. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. The last question we've got is for you, Dan, which is, what is your favourite carb-based food?
I mean,
is it naughty or is it nice? You can have more than one, actually.
Yeah, the thing is, I eat so much and eat so many carbs in terms of like pasta, pizza, rice, bread, just the amount of carbohydrates I'll sort of take on, even if it's like honey, jam, that sort of thing, is so high that I wouldn't really say I've got a favourite. I would say my go-to, if I'm, for example, come back home from a day at work or something, or I've been out for the day and I come back home and then I've got a session to do, my go-to is always like a bagel with jam on, because I know that it's high in carbohydrates, but it's also got that obviously sugary carbohydrates on top with the jam and stuff. And I always find that helps set me up nicely for maybe a bike or a run session. Obviously, for me, I've got to be a little bit careful in terms of, I try to, when it comes to running, you don't want to eat too close to the run because it can generally have a little bit of an impact on your stomach. But cycling, you can get a lot more away with it a lot more. But like in terms of like what I'll eat sort of the day before a race, it's very much a case of I try and keep it as simple as I can, because it'll probably be like a pasta bake and then maybe half a pizza or something, rather than anything that's too. I've always got this thing in my mind, is if you try something new the day before a race, it's potentially not going to go wrong, so not going to go right. So you don't want to try anything new, and you just want to use what you can do. I've had guys to me in the past that have come to me and said, on a race day, my nutrition has been totally fine, but then when I do a session with the same nutrition, it doesn't go right. And I say to them, okay, well, what have you eaten the day before? And they say the day before the race, they've had a high carb meal with pasta and a pizza, but the day before their training session, because they didn't think it was a race, they went out for a curry the night before, and it was like, well, of course that's going to have an impact on it. So yeah, you've just got to try, and I think the best bit of advice from me is just keep it as simple as you can. Don't Don't do anything you wouldn't do.
I think what you brought up as well, which is part of this discussion, is that if you get your nutrition right for your training and you practice with your pre-training nutrition and your during training nutrition, and you know it works, then you go into your event with huge confidence. So it's almost finding something that works for you, finding a pattern. And God, how many people do you hear who just don't use energy products until race day?
Well,
it's nuts.
You would never wear a new pair of trainers on race day.
No.
So why would you use new nutrition on race day?
Yeah.
It's literally the same thing, and it's really, I like to sort of get in my mind to the point where when I do get to race day, everything I've done in the past, it's just like, it just on repeat continuously. So I know exactly what I'm doing when, so that when I do get to race day, it's very much a case of, okay, I've not got to change anything. There's only a slight one tiny little thing that I might change on race day, but I don't want to talk about that right now.
Yeah,
we might get to that.
I was going to say, before we spoil too much of the rest of the podcast, let's finish the original talking point. So obviously we've covered quite a bit of what carbohydrate is just now, and there are two more macronutrients in our diet. One of them that's discussed a lot is protein. So Matt, what is protein?
What is protein? Well, it's the building blocks of our body. So it mainly it's present in your muscles and in vital organs within your body, and also all the enzymes. So the biological catalysts that allow all the chemical reactions to take place. In terms of where we get it from, there's a variety of different sources. So obviously, if you eat meat, you've got fish. You can really choose down and hone down some nice sort of low fat sources through meat. If you go for chicken and you go for sort of lean fish and so on and so forth. You've also got protein so for vegetarians, it's vital that they mix their pulses and their grains. So if you mix your pulses and grains, you get a really full protein, which we won't go into too much detail, but it's effectively all of the amino acids that are essential for life. You also get a lot of carbs if you take your protein in that way. So as carbohydrate is an important endurance product, I've always, as a coach, said, try and consume more beans, more pulses, because we get plenty of rice, we get plenty of cereals, but if you can push the pulses side of things, not only are you pushing your carbohydrate up, but you're also creating that complete protein. Are there any other? Oh, we've got dairy, haven't we? So dairy would be the other big form of protein intake, but you sometimes have to be a little bit careful because it can come with quite a lot of fat.
So my question to you now is, obviously when you go into Aldi or Lidl or somewhere, it's a generic supermarket, they have got now a protein section. You've got protein yogurts, you've got the little protein bars, they do protein rice pudding. Because sometimes I think that if you look at a generic Greek yogurt compared to a high protein yogurt, like they say, you actually look at the amount of protein in the difference between them. There's not actually that much. It's just people tend to go for them all because they say on them high protein.
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting. There is a difference between I'd call this a supplement food. So it's a food that's designed to, I should say, meet the needs of what people believe social media tells them to believe. But there's something that has been researched is eggs. So obviously there's a difference in the content of egg white and egg yolk.
Right, yeah.
And people have researched the separation of the two. And what we were consuming, because obviously they're two different things. One has high fat content, one has high protein content, one has the nutrients in it, one doesn't. And they've actually found when you consume a whole egg, rather than that protein dense part of the egg, that you get a better muscle protein synthesis reaction. So in layman's terms, that is, you get more muscle growth from consuming a whole egg. So again, I think they are useful to have supplement food, but I'd always argue for a food first and whole food approach to a diet. It should be a sort of the food supplement should be an insurance policy,
Right, yeah.
rather than something you add into your daily diet. I'd always advocate for a whole food approach too, and especially around micronutrients, which we'll come on to, but fats and proteins, the quality that we're getting in is tremendously important. And this is before we even discuss potential gaps in the food market regarding nitrogen testing, which is how we find out how much protein is actually in a product. And through that, there are ways to actually cheat the system. I'm not suggesting that these products are anyway lying or they're not true, but it is documented that previous brands have fudged the nitrogen in a product to lie about the protein content.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the only thing I'd add to that is there's the kind of comes on to our next point, which is how much protein does the body need? And sometimes, obviously, I concur with Cav because we're TORQ, but everything about nutrition, it's diet first. When you look at the TORQ product range, they're there as an extra thing. They're there as a convenient extra thing that will give you a little bit more, but your diet fundamentally has to be really strong. And so I totally concur with the whole food approach. If you're wanting to get protein in on regular doses throughout the day, and it tends to be, we're talking every 4 hours or so, you should be getting 20 to 25 grams of protein. I think sometimes these products you're talking about are a handy, convenient way to hit that 20 to 25 grams, and a lot of them tend to advertise that on
100%. I mean, I sort of, when I'm out and about, having these, they do them now as like pouches. They're like pouch yogurts, 20 grams of protein in. They're just so easy to pick up, take with you. You've not got to think about. You think of like if you take on a generic dairy-based product, you've got a pot, you've got a spoon, you've got to try and faff about with it. Whereas this, it's just literally a pouch. You just squeeze it down, 20 grams of protein straight away. But I totally understand what you're saying. You've got to have them consistent diet and meals across the day to be able to get that high protein in anyway. And I like, for me, I find that chicken is like the best thing in terms of being able to get that high protein in.
It's about having those meals, isn't it? Your consistent meals and making sure that you do have a balanced diet. But as an athlete at your level, and when people are training, in those gaps to get that 20 to 25 grams of protein, it's about finding methods and ways.
I mean, the best thing I found that I've done is when we, for example, we'll make a meal in the evening. We will always make it, even though there's only 2 of us in the house, we'll always make it for 4 people. And then we'll put the other 2 in pots, stick them in the fridge, and then we'll have it for lunch the next day. So yes, it sounds like monotonous. You're eating the same thing for lunch as you have for tea, but you're
never short of food.
Exactly. Whereas if you haven't got that, you're then going to the fridge and you're thinking, what am I going to make? And then if you're in a rush, you're like, okay, I'll just go to the shop and I'll buy a sandwich or something. And there's not always a guarantee that that's going to be the best thing to be able to do. So we've always found that
just making that a little bit more,
having it ready for the next day is like, it's a no-brainer.
Perfect.
So yeah, that's the way. The way I do things.
The only thing I was going to ask Cav on this subject as well is, what is the purpose? We talk about this sort of 4 or 5 hour window with protein, 20 to 25 grams. Can you just explain a little bit about why we would do that as an athlete?
Yeah. So the protein window of every 4 hours is crucial. Simply because we don't store protein in our body, so having constant top-ups of it is key to make sure that we're taking advantage. So while training is actually the biggest stimulus of, again, muscle protein synthesis, having adequate protein within our body at the time is key to make sure that we're getting the most recovery from this training we're doing and that we're limiting the impact on the next day's session. Something that I think is worthwhile covering as well is the discussion of the anabolic window. For people who don't know what that is, it's the theory that you need to consume protein immediately after exercise to limit muscle damage and other things. From my interpretation of the reading, I don't believe this exists, and the biggest key point takeaway from this is that you should be consuming protein every 4 hours. Regardless, and that the timing around exercise is not necessarily as relevant as it has been made out in the media in previous years. Again, if we're discussing our products, our recovery product, we have protein and carbohydrate. So regarding how you feel in the next day for the training, or so Dan, if you're training 2, 3, 4 days in a row, the biggest thing is having carbohydrate readily available for your body after exercise, and protein as well can help supplement how the body reacts to the absorption of the carbohydrate and allow us to store carbohydrate better. So that's why recovery has a lot of carbs and protein in it as well. As I say, eating only protein immediately after exercise will not achieve what it is advertised to.
What's really interesting on that point, though, is like it's almost everything Cav said is absolutely spot on. But when you've been out for a 4-hour bike ride, or you've been for a long, like I should stop talking about bikes, been for a long run. Okay, so you know, if you've been for a long run or you've exercised for a long period of time, as you'll discover, you know, we're talking about consuming carbohydrate during that period. So it's probably time that you have protein anyway. But it's more kind of correlation rather than causation, I suppose, is what Cav's saying there. So it further, to get that 20 to 25 grams in a recovery drink, in most situations you're going to need it at that point anyway. So but that's I'm not going to ask you what your favorite protein food is, because you said chicken. So you know, you've kind of jumped the gun a little bit on that one. But just moving on, because we've got a fair bit to cover, is fat is the we're not going to dwell on this one because it tends to be a little bit kind of incidental, really. We don't need, as endurance athletes, necessarily to hunt for fat. But you know, fat is in most stuff. But the one thing we did want to talk about was were the healthy kind of fats. I don't know if Cav wants to talk about the omegas, or I mean, I'll mention 8 vitamins A, D, E, and K, which are fat soluble. If you cut fat out from your diet, you're going to cut those vitamins out, so they're very important as well. But we've also got omega 3 and omega 6. Omega 6 tends to be very common in the diet. But have you got anything to say on omega 3, or do you want me to carry on?
I can interject. So omega 3 is key for like brain function and things. But with our move towards more Western diets over the last few years, this is something we really don't get in enough. So as you'll hear in the media, a lot of people talk about oily fish such as salmon. That's a great place to find omega 3. But when you actually talk about how much salmon you need to eat to get in enough omega 3, might make some people raise their eyes, especially at the price of salmon nowadays. But I think it's, from what I know, 3 to 4 portions a week of 170 grams of salmon.
And I think that's something that obviously we haven't touched on here, but in order to get this in, it actually is, with like the way that prices are rising, it actually is quite expensive to do, which is why I think you do get a lot of people that sort of don't eat as healthily, because it is actually cheaper to do that. So like you said, the amount of salmon you need and how much salmon costs, realistically you need to be really financially stable to be able to take in that amount.
So I've got a solution for that, Dan. There's chia and flax. So chia seeds and flax seeds are extremely high in omega 3. And the general consensus is that you should be aiming for between at a 4-to-1 ratio of omega 6 to omega 3. Obviously, with the general Western diet, our omega 6 pushes that ratio way higher on the omega 6 side. So if you have chia, you have flax, you've got your salmon as well, which is obviously very rich. All of these things, they pull the ratio back the other way, so that your mix of fats becomes much more like 4-to-1. Interestingly, walnuts are 4-to-1. They're rich in protein. They're almost the perfect, well, they are the perfect mix of omega 3 to 6, but you can't live your life on eating walnuts. So the idea is that if you go for things like chia and flax and your salmon, you start to pull things back the other way. And as Cav said, brain health, just so many health aspects, heart health, circulatory health, really important that you do try and get the omega 3s in through your fats. But it's just trying to choose those options. I put the chia on my breakfast every morning. Just moving on to the last bit of this, I'm going to dwell on it, but the micronutrient side of things. So we did say fat and micronutrients. We're talking about vitamins, we're talking about minerals, all these extra sort of tiny little things that make a difference to your life. My opinion, it's in line with our philosophy at TORQ and what Kaz's been talking about, is that most of this stuff, if you have a healthy, rich, balanced diet, you're going to get most of this stuff. And if you're an endurance athlete, by virtue of the fact that you're eating more, you get more, but some foods, if you can go organic, we talked about the cost of salmon. The cost of going organic isn't cheap. I mean, if you can grow your own foods in an ideal world and you can go organic, you're going to get rich nutrients. But have either of you guys got any suggestions as to what we might want to supplement with on a micronutrient level beyond your diet?
I can tell you what I supplement.
Go on, we'll start with you, Dan. Tell me what you do, and I'll offer some input.
I tend to take on 4 supplements every morning. So the first one is just a generic multivitamin tablet. That's just to keep, obviously, that's full of lots of multivitamins, but they're not a massively high level in terms of the amount you get from each one. The other one I'll take is omega-3 fish oil to try and keep on top of that, because it, like you say, it's difficult to get the amount that you need in. I'll also take, this is quite a funny one. I don't know why I take it, to be honest, but I've just heard it works. This is turmeric and black pepper.
Oh, yeah, turmeric. Yeah, this is maybe a subject of another podcast, so we'll not get too much into this, but we're not going to, that's...
And then the last one is a vitamin D3 tablet, just because...
Perfect.
Sweet. So, I'm going to follow up with that. The vast majority of the British population do not have enough vitamin D. And the links between well-being and mental health and vitamin D are, well, it's hard to overstate them.
And immunity.
Yeah, and your immunity as well. Especially during winter, I think it's up to like 80% of the British population don't have enough vitamin D. As a it's not always best in nutrition advice to offer blanket statements, but in this case, I think everyone should be supplementing with vitamin D, especially during the winter months. A lot of you will know you go to your job for 9 o'clock and it's dark, and you leave your job at 5 o'clock and it's dark. So there's no natural sunlight in there to get a good amount of vitamin D. Following on from that, something you've not mentioned, which I would recommend, is zinc supplementation. So an athlete, you use up a lot of zinc. So it would be worth considering supplementing with that, especially from a immunity basis as well. So, go on then.
So every evening before I go to bed, I'll take what they call a ZMA tablet.
Okay.
So I believe that's got zinc inside of it. What else it has in it?
Magnesium.
Yeah,
probably.
Exactly, magnesium, because I don't know how true it is, but apparently magnesium helps you sleep. So so I'll take them every evening before I go to bed. I don't know how high they are, how much zinc you actually get from that.
I'm sure you have done all this research and that you have forgotten, but if we're talking very quickly to elite athletes and especially professionals, please always, like we've talked about food first, but please always check what you are consuming.
Yeah, you have to be really careful.
Not that we're not in this case that I'm going to mention doping or anything in that manner, but for your own health and perspective, we want to make sure that what you're putting in your body is what you need. In a very simple manner, you're making your urine very expensive. In a best case, and in a worst case, you might be taking on too much of a supplement, which could have a negative effect. But we'll leave it at that. Just make sure you know what you're putting in your own body. Better safe than sorry.
And evidence-based as well. So Dan is very lucky to have us.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it is just, take it if there's a good amount of evidence behind it. But, zinc and magnesium, if that's what it is, sounds good to me. And then, just to carry on the vitamin D thing, I won't labour the point, but we all wear sunscreen. So in the summer, we protect ourselves from the sunlight for obvious reasons, and that reduces the amount of vitamin D that we get. And then obviously we live in Britain. You may be watching this from abroad, but we live in Britain, and it makes our natural vitamin D production generally pretty rubbish at the best of times. So I don't have my zinc and magnesium lasting at night. We're just refining our TORQ Defend product at the moment, but we did have a vitamin D3 and zinc supplement, which I still have some left of, so I take that every evening. But I'm vitamin D3, 1000 IU every single day. Couldn't concur more with Cav on that one. So moving on from micronutrients, so this is hopefully giving you a good picture as to how your general diet should be. Let's move on to fueling during exercise. And I explained a little bit earlier about endogenous and exogenous stores. Endogenous stores and exogenous carbohydrate. So we store endogenous carbohydrate as glycogen in the liver and muscles. The endogenous stores of carbohydrate, as we've discussed, are limited to about 500 grams or 2,000 calories. When they run out, we hit the wall. And so the whole point of fueling during exercise is that you give your body an alternative fuel source to your stores. So if Dan's taking a 30-gram TORQ gel, it's 30 grams of carbohydrate that very quickly gets into his blood, and he burns that instead of his stores. It's as simple as that. So basically his stores are protected, and it's protection of your glycogen stores. The more carbohydrate per hour you can take on board, and there are limits to the amount we can absorb, then the more carbohydrate that is available for being burnt, and therefore the more your stores are protected. And it's when your stores run out of carbohydrate that you hit the wall or you bonk. That's probably a pretty neat summation of how it all works. This is a really interesting subject now, is how many grams of carbohydrate per hour should we be consuming? And I think it's probably fair to say, Cav, isn't it, that it's an area that is hugely debated at the moment as to like how much you put into your body through your fueling is not necessarily how much you use, is it?
Yeah.
And what we really want to get across here, and we're going to talk to Dan about his fueling practices as well, is that certainly from my experience when I've spoken to marathon runners, and we go to shows, we go to events, people are massively under fueling, massively, hugely. I mean, some people aren't even doing 30 grams of carbohydrate an hour, which is a gel an hour. And we might be some people watching this and thinking, well, I only have 2 gels in the whole marathon. I don't. One gel an hour is barely enough, right? And we often say, well, what about 60? What about 90? What about beyond? What would be really interesting, Dan, because obviously you've run marathons and you've done this real ultra endurance stuff. Let's start with training. What if tell us a little bit about how much carbohydrate per hour you would do on different types of sessions.
I think for me, I generally sort of know that I can get away with a 90-minute session without really taking much carbohydrates on board. However, you've then got to think that if you don't take that carbohydrates on board, how is it going to affect you
the next day
and later down the line?
Which is your eat today for tomorrow.
Exactly. So if I sort of do a 90-minute session and I might, for example, just maybe take on some electrolytes, but maybe a bit of hydration, that sort of thing, I will always make sure that once I've done that session, I will always eat something high in carb afterwards, and obviously try and get the protein back on after that session to try and sort of replenish them stores. However, as soon as you're going over sort of an hour and a half, you need to try and get that amount of carbohydrates on board during the session to be able to get you to the end of the session. It's also obviously it'd be good to hear your thoughts on this, but I'm a big believer in, even when you're doing, for example, a low intensity session, it's good to be able to train your body to be able to take on as much as you would if you were doing a higher intensity session for the same amount of time, for example. I don't know, obviously, there's probably some sort of theory to say that you're not going to use as much as the carbohydrates during that lower intensity session, because obviously if you're working at a low intensity, your carbohydrates, you're using less carbohydrates, even though you're working at the same amount of time. But if you want to get a good amount of carbohydrates on, you need to train the gut to be able to take that amount of carbohydrates on. So in order to do it in, say, for example, a 3 hour endurance bike session, that is obviously, like, for me, that's going to be nowhere near as intense as if I'm doing an Ironman specific bike session. I would potentially still try and take on the same amount of carbs during that session as I would during the high intensity bike session.
I'm just going to answer this, and then I'm going to pass to Cav, because Cav's itching to answer this one. But I think I would always say fuel for the work required, which means that if it's a lower intensity session, you tend to be burning more fat because it is lower intensity. You've got less need for carbs. I think the fact that you've said eat for today for tomorrow, completely agree with. So it's an hour and a half session. I think most athletes need to fuel most of their sessions. I mean, we could talk about fasted training at some point, but maybe that's another podcast. But there are exceptions to this rule.
Yeah, of course.
But generally speaking, if you fuel during your session, it means that you need to eat less afterwards, and you're maintaining your carb store so that you can train again the next day. I think with the training the gut side of things, I'm sure Cav's got stuff to say on this, but you don't necessarily need to train the gut during exercise. It's training the transporters within the gut with your general diet as well. I don't know if that's how you feel, but my thoughts before I pass to Cav would be, but I'm a bit of an old hat, this is why we have young sports scientists on board, but I would tend to fuel for the work required, but I would absolutely, on race day, I would want to make sure that my body could tolerate and use high levels of carbohydrate. And your method is one. Cav's going to talk about whether...
Just before Cav gets in, I think you've also got to obviously, you've got the general public out there. This is like my job.
Yes.
And I'm fortunate enough to obviously be supported by yourself. So financially, it's a bit easier for me to take on what I need to take on race day. Whereas if you've got a generic average Joe out there, I'm not saying that you need to go in every single session, take on exactly what you're going to take during your marathon, because it's not going to work.
Yeah, so I agree with what Matt said, and I've agreed with what you said.
How diplomatic.
However, fueling for the work required, as Matt touched on, is the absolute foundation of everything that I'd advise. And there's a slight caveat in this. So we've just touched on Dan consuming what I'm going to assume is a very high amount of carbohydrate.
Well, we know it is, don't we?
Yeah,
How much is it, Dan?
I try to sort of aim for 150 grams an hour.
Yeah, so
monstrous.
Just a quick explanation. There's four calories in every gram of carbohydrate. So Dan is consuming 600 calories, give or take, every hour of exercise he does. And as you'll know, the TORQ fueling system, just touch on very quickly before we get more into it, we say as easy as 1, 2, 3. And 3 is only 90 grams. So Dan's doing almost double that. But this is what I was going to touch on. There is, as Dan's already said, he is lucky to be partnered with TORQ. We support him. We offer advice we can. But when Dan talks about his bike rides, what's your average power?
Are you depending on? Are you talking?
Just
it depends on how far I'm going. What the session is.
3 hours easy. What's your average power?
210, 220 maybe.
Okay, so again, we'll link that back to running. Seeing as we're on marathon training, so say your pace is you're going to do a 3 hour run.
If I go out for a like marathon training run, for example, at like 3 hours, you're probably looking at like somewhere between 7 to 7.5 minute miles.
Yeah, so this is exactly what I was going to touch on. So for you compared to other people that are more recreational based, those speeds and those powers may feel quite high.
Yeah.
Just to touch on very quickly, in a more simple manner, a watt is a joule per second. We can directly link that to calories. So even though Dan might be burning less carbohydrates than his fractional utilization, so his utilization of carbohydrates may be less. The sheer calories that he'll be burning on an easy ride will be much more than the average Joe. So whilst you just touched on saying that he might not need as much as he's putting in, your calorie expenditure over the hour will be much higher than a weekend warrior, because your ability, effectively.
Yeah.
So even though for Dan it's easy and his carbohydrate use may be lower relatively, he's still ripping through a ton of calories. So I think that's an important caveat between a recreational athlete and a professional athlete, is that, like we've said, Dan's taking a sheer load of carbs on. It's important to consider the context, and I think that's not talked about much in the media nowadays, is like your absolute speed versus a recreational athlete's absolute speed. I just wanted to touch on that.
No, I agree.
So here, where we're talking about Dan gut training, he's burning through so many calories that he's just replacing what he can as much as he can. But you should always practice your race day nutrition ahead of the day.
Yeah, and just to touch on the 150 grams thing, I mean, it is an enormous amount, but I think if any of you have been looking in the media, again, it's probably more the cycling media, it's not uncommon. And I think we're in an area of carbohydrate consumption during exercise that is exceptionally high in the last few years. That as Cav explained, what we do with TORQ, just to make things very, very easy, is everything is in TORQ units. So everything is in 30-gram carb units. So we have traditionally recommended 90 grams as being the top end of what somebody should consume. Recent studies are showing that you can go beyond that, and there are benefits of going beyond that 90 grams. How far you take it, this is the grey area, and you know, there are studies that show that when your carb consumption goes up, there's one study in particular that shows that if your carb consumption gets particularly high, you actually down-regulate your fat metabolism, and therefore you lose the benefit that carbohydrate gives you. So there's a very it's definitely an area of discussion, but Dan is completely in line with what the practice of a lot of the pros. And there has been a recent study that's shown 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour has showed the highest amount of oxidation ever recorded.
I think as well, the benefit is because obviously the products that you make, the gels they're not like massive gels, they're quite nice and compact. So taking one gel doesn't feel like a massive amount of substance going inside of the body. So even though, yes, there's 30 grams of carbs in there, you don't feel like you're not like eating, for example, a massive piece of cake that is going to sit in your body. It's something that fits in really easily. And then it's just, so for me to be able to take like 4 or 5 of them an hour is not actually...
Doesn't feel like too much.
No, it doesn't feel like too much.
Just to bring this back down to earth, so we've got a pro who's doing some very high levels of carbs. My conversations with people who are recreational marathon runners, getting them to do 30 grams of carbohydrate or 1 gel an hour is a start. I like to try and get them onto 60, which is, and I don't want this kind of high level of carbohydrate to detract from the benefit of taking in smaller amounts, because it is very much a niche kind of top end thing. 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour will give you some significant benefits, especially if you've never fueled before. And the 90 grams, which is the top end of the TORQ fueling system, if you can get yourself there, you're looking at 3 gels an hour. It's a gel every 20 minutes. For most people, for me, that's my limit. I think if I was reborn and I decided that I was going to compete at a really high level, or if that happens, sure, I'm going to experiment with some higher levels of carbohydrate. Now that research is there, but for what I want to do, I'm comfortable with 90. I've been fine with 90. And I would recommend that anybody watching this podcast, if you're new to fueling, just draw the line at 90. 90 is enough. And if you do 60 grams an hour, well done to you. And I think you'll notice some real significant differences. hey, if you're more experienced, listen to Dan. Maybe try and push the limit a little bit.
I think as well, what you've got to take into consideration is when you've got the top end guys that are going and running a marathon in 2 hours 30 to 2 hours 50. If you're looking at 90, if they're looking at 150 grams an hour, their amount that they're taking throughout the whole race is probably similar to someone who's doing 90 grams an hour but going and running 4 hours, because they're out there for a longer time, but you're still both doing the same distance. It's not, yes, you're out there for a longer time if you're doing 4 hours compared to like 2.5, but you might be taking the same amount of carbs for the same distance that you've run. So I agree with what you're saying in terms of, I mean, when we went to the running show a couple of weeks ago, the amount of people that came up to me and I said, what's your nutrition? And they're like, well, I don't take anything. And it's like, well, you've got to then start somewhere, and 60 grams will give you a big benefit if you're taking nothing.
It's a lot for, it's a lot for some people. It's, a gel, if you think about a gel every half an hour, if you're running 4 to 5 hours, is a lot of gels to carry.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And we're going to talk about that in a bit, but how to carry your fuel. But for my experience, things move on. But for my experience, and I would just say this to everyone: if you can get yourself to 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour, that's good, right? Give us a call, drop us a line. We can talk to you about the next steps and what to do, because if you're going to start going beyond that, there are things that you need to do to make sure, as you said, that your gut can tolerate it. And the research is, it would be pointless to be taking large amounts on to not get any benefit, wouldn't it? And I think this is the area we're just in at the moment, where the research just needs to catch up with practice a little bit.
I think as well, obviously, from my mind of where I'm thinking from, when I do, for example, do an Ironman, I will always take on more on the bike compared to what I do on the run. And obviously, we're focusing on the run here today. So I'm not saying that I'm going to take 150 grams an hour if I'm going and doing a Seoul marathon. I might be sort of between 100 to 120, but I'm not. You've also got to think of how you can get them on board. When you're on a bike, for example, it's a lot easier to handle and to digest bars, flapjacks, jellies, whereas when you're on the run, you're quite limited in terms of what you can actually take on.
Yeah, so I knew we were going to talk about covering this later, but I think with that topic you've just come on to, Dan, I think it would be a good time to reach behind the sofa and look at some of the products we've brought with us today. So obviously Dan's just discussed and covered the fact that it's a struggle to basically carry the amount of energy gels we're recommended sometimes. So in front of us, we've got a couple of different products. We've got a belt.
There is a zip on that, by the way, so they're not going to.
Yeah, so we've got a running belt that has 2 small bottles on it. A zip to carry energy gels. We've got some runners in house actually who run at TORQ, and they say they're not a big fan of the belts because of like the bouncing. Something Matt has just put on is a running vest, as he just said, a bit small for him. But for this, where it's got some hydro flasks and zip pockets on either side to carry energy gels in.
I think they're really good for like.
It's a good place to carry.
I think they're really good for like when you're talking like ultra distance races, because you've got a lot of space.
4 gels in that pocket, and it's so much more space.
I personally, when I run a marathon, I'll use something like that. I prefer it around my waist rather than over my shoulders.
Yeah.
And obviously having the bottles in there helps keep. You can put the hydration and electrolytes in there as well. It's then obviously contemplating how many gels you're actually taking on board. When I, for example, do when I go on an Ironman marathon, I've obviously got a tri-suit on and I've got pockets. I'll put gels in pockets and stuff as well as in there, so it doesn't bounce around too much. It's finding the limit between it bouncing around enough, but then you don't want it to be so tight that it's like cramming on your stomach and stuff. So it's finding a limit there of how many gels can it handle while not bouncing around too much.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I must say I am not a marathon runner, but I have ran before, 5 and 10Ks. And having done triathlon and stuff, I've like looked at carrying fuel, and yeah, I agree with everything you just said there, Dan. But if you are running a marathon and you want to look into carrying fuel, consider how much you may need, what you enjoy taking, as that's a big part of fueling, and the best way it works for you. Like Dan's just said, he prefers a belt. One of the ultra runners that is here at TORQ, he prefers the vest. But yeah, like this is a way for you to carry the TORQ fueling system, or energy gels and stuff, and make sure you are fueled. There are ways to do it. It's just figuring out what works best for you.
Yeah, I think it's easy for us to say, isn't it? We've kind of touched on it, take 2 gels an hour, and it's like, well, where do I put them?
Yeah.
Especially when you're out for 4 or 5 hours. And these are some solutions. I meant to bring this along, but I didn't. I've got, I did a half marathon in September, and I've just got this like a lycra, like the top of an arm warmer.
Right,
and it's got 3 little pockets in it.
Yeah.
And if I had one of those on each side of my arm, that's 6 gels, and they're in a really good place because they're at this sort of top of the rotation of your shoulder. And I think just wearing that, actually, I mean, you've got the thermal disadvantage, I guess. If it's a hot day, you've got an extra layer, haven't you, as well, which is a bit of an issue. But they are in quite a nice place. But how many gels would you comfortably carry around your waist, Dan?
Probably 5 or 6, maybe. If I'm taking, say just an example, if I'm taking like 12 over like a 3-hour marathon, I'll tend to put sort of 5 or 6 into there. I might put a few in a pocket that maybe I've got on my back, and then I might just carry a few, to be honest. Sometimes it can be a point of, I don't want this to sound really bad, but when you do like an Ironman marathon, they always say, okay, carry enough to get you 3/4 of the way through. And then the final quarter is just a case of, because you've got aid stations and stuff, just get in what you can to be able to get to the finish line. I mean, I'm a really, really big fan of like when you bought out the jellies, they're a massive game changer, because obviously if you're going and running a marathon and you're trying to take 12 gels for a marathon, it's a lot of gel-based substance. Obviously, you're lucky with the amount of flavors, and it's not one continuous flavor, but having something like maybe 1 or 2 packs of jellies throughout that time helps you a little bit of a different texture to get down, something a bit more solid. Obviously, you've got to be a little bit careful and make sure your stomach is able to handle that while running, but having something that's a little bit of a different texture is quite a nice little treat, really. And because there's obviously 6 in a pack, you don't have to take them all in one go. You can spread them out across.
Yeah, so basically, when we look at the types of fuel at TORQ, it's been really important to us to make sure that they're 30-gram carb units, which is what the fueling system's about. So we have bars, we have a whole packet of jellies. They're both 30-gram carb units, as is a gel. And it's about providing a variety of textures, a variety of flavours, but they are 30-gram carb units. So it comes down to user preference. But what you've highlighted, Dan, which is, I think, how many runners feel, is that the gel is the go-to for marathon running. And then the jellies are kind of almost... they're in there as well. For ultra running, it tends to be maybe bars and things, because it tends to be lower intensity and it tends to be longer. But the great thing that you mentioned there is that, with a packet of jellies, you get 6 jellies in there and they're 30 grams of carbs. If you're going to go for 60 grams of carbs an hour, you can graze on the packet of jellies over an hour and have a gel an hour as well. And then you've hit your 60 grams, or you could do a gel every half an hour. But it just gives you that variety, and there's no right or wrong. It's just get your 60 grams of carbs in. And I'm going to keep talking about 60 because I think that's what most of you should be doing, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, so that's on the sort of the textures and the flavors. Have we got anything else that we need to discuss on the fueling side?
I think something that people might ask questions about is the TORQ energy drink. Whilst it's part of the fueling system, as we all know, there is a limited amount how much we can carry. Like we said, on some of the belts, there's bottles there as well, but those bottles are quite small. They're like fist sized. So I think this sort of links into the hydration a bit.
There's a little
okay.
So, like we just said, you don't get an opportunity to carry much bottles. So, how much is based on it?
300 ml or something.
250.
Yeah, about 250. So yeah, and you might not even want to carry that again. Like, it's extra weight. It might bounce around. So skipping the energy drink on this one might be something that we recommend, but like Dan said, for the last quarter of our Ironman is taking advantage of the fuel stations or the aid stations. In a marathon, that's definitely what we'd advocate for. So making sure we're getting enough hydration through, like during these aid stations. Water's limited, so really making the most of them. It's difficult to balance, obviously, because if you're wanting to carry a personalized product like an electrolyte, like we offer the TORQ hydration, obviously if the feed station's not going to have everything you wish it to have. So this is when it's important to weigh up what you can carry versus what is readily available at the aid stations.
If you've got the capability to do it, then if you carry like a little, you can carry like a little hydration sachet in there. When you pick up your water, you can then rip that sachet open and put it into the water to make hydration. But it's very dependent on sort of if you've got the capability to do that while you're running along. It's not an easy task to be able to do.
Is it fair to say that, like, so with cycling, so Cav rightly said, with running, the energy drink probably doesn't really come into it. Cycling, it's the first thing. It's on your bike. Energy drink is number one.
Yeah.
With running, would you say there's a little bit of a compromise, really, in that, yes, you can hit your fueling targets, but in the marathon itself, you're probably relying on the feed stations to be able to grab a gel, chase it with a load of water. That mixes in your stomach effectively, because that's all an energy drink is. An energy drink is a very weak energy gel. But obviously there's the electrolytes where there's maybe a little bit of a compromise there. Or could you run a more concentrated electrolyte solution in your bottle?
I mean, you could, it's obviously
put a couple of sachets in there, make it stronger.
What works for you? If you were to, you could, like you say, run a concentrated one, take a swig, and then put some water.
Put loads of water, and it all mixes.
Yeah. It's one of them where obviously we're in a fortunate position where the gels do have electrolytes in anyway,
which really helps,
which is a big benefit. But electrolytes as well is also dependent on what conditions you're racing. If it's stupidly hot, you obviously need more hydration and more electrolytes to prevent you from.
I think it comes down to that practicing in your training what you're going to do on the event. But the fueling is easy, because that is, you decide how many TORQ units you're going to have. The hydration is your variable. And if it is a particularly hot event, you just need to drink a lot more. But the most important thing is to get enough fluid in. But you can't ignore the electrolytes. So maybe carrying a more concentrated version, or taking some sachets with you that you can add, like you say, at the feed stations. The time it takes you to add the sachet to your drink is time you're going to get back because you've hydrated properly.
I don't want to go too off track here, but when I went to the Ironman World Champs about 3 or 4 years ago in Kona, it's like 30 plus degrees, 90% humidity. And I can tell you now that the main reason for not doing a very good marathon there was not down to fueling, it was more down to the hydration side of things. Because you need to probably take on 4, 5, 6, 7 litres of water and hydration to be able to get it right, really. And that's obviously becomes difficult because you're taking on all this fluid, you're trying to take on all these carbohydrates as well, and it's a lot to take in.
This might be another podcast for future, is competition in heat or training in heat. I think is a good topic. And I'm sure you can tell us all about the issues with high carb consumption in heat. It can be quite difficult. Recovery then, after some of our marathon training, what do you, I say you is almost an accusatory term.
Right in his face.
What does your training look like? Sorry, your recovery look like after training?
I think, like you say, it's one of the recovery is touched on a lot through protein. I will always take a recovery drink after a session. I don't know why. Like you said before, it's science has proven it's probably not needed. However, like Matt said, when you're going out and you're running for three hours, you're then in that window of take it on straight away.
Well, you need it for the carbs anyway. So I think obviously there's some research that Cav covered. And what we're basically saying is you need to have these regular protein hits anyway. It's just that actually a recovery drink, it's correlation, causation. The protein in the recovery drink will help you to store the carbs. There's a facilitating action there, and it puts protein into your body probably when you need it anyway. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it is, I don't want to downplay how important a recovery drink is, because it is really important. And for 99% of the time, it's when you need the protein anyway, and you certainly need to get the carbs into the system.
I think for me though, yes, obviously recovery comes, like you say, it is important. The biggest recovery benefit for me is sleep. If you sleep well, sleep enough, that will give you the biggest recovery benefit, because I don't think people realise how important and how much recovery you can gain from sleeping. I'm in a fortunate position where
that's your job.
I work
your job is to sleep.
I work part-time, so I will consistently get 8-9 hours a day.
Yeah.
Whereas you've got people there that are working up at 4 a.m. to go to work, not going to bed till 10 o'clock, they're getting 6 hours, so their recovery is obviously a lot less. And you're also talking about like time on feet. If you work and you do quite a manual job, your recovery is going to be, you're doing a lot more physically compared to someone who's sort of maybe either sitting in an office, or like me, where I only work part-time, I can sit on the sofa for half of the day when I'm not training. So yeah,
and I think that's what marks the difference between you've probably the actual physical recovery and rest is what makes a pro different to the rest of us. And like, absolutely, it makes an enormous difference when it comes to sort of nutritional interventions. We've talked about a recovery drink or getting the carbs in and the protein, certainly, if necessary. But after that, it's then about what it comes back to your general diet.
Yeah,
again,
of course it does. And that's the main thing. I think the general diet is so important. If your general diet, I've always sort of thought about this. I heard a couple of years ago, someone said to me, well, you can't out-train a bad diet. So if your diet's not great, you can do all the training in the world, but you're not going to get rid of...
You're not going to get the adaptation, which is probably the next subject.
Yeah, so it just, I think, summarises fuel well, recover well, adapt well, and then you can train hard or even harder. And at the end of the day, that is training. We stress our bodies, we break our balance, and our body recovers and adapts to that. And the better we recover, the better we adapt. So.
Okay, I'm just going to add a little bit to that, and then before we move on to our last subject, because we have talked for a while, which is, I think, just talking about adaptation is really important, because this whole podcast is about fueling your training for a marathon, and it's slightly different to fueling your marathon itself, because quite frankly, when you finish your marathon, you can have a recovery drink if you want, but you probably deserve a beer and a pizza, and you can have whatever you want, because unless you're really prepared to get out and do some running again in the next few days, I'd be, at the end of the day, you've done what you've set, you've hit your target. When it comes to training, the recovery drink, the diet, you're constantly trying to replenish your body and recover after sessions so that you do adapt. And I think that's the bit that we do really need to get across in this podcast, is when you hit marathon day, yes, you're going to fuel on marathon day to get the best out of it, but you want to be the fittest you can possibly be.
Yeah.
And you're only going to get fit if you train hard, take the nutrition, rest hard, which is what you've said.
Yeah, exactly. And like, it's one of them things where there's so many things out there now in terms of like, obviously you've got sports massage, you've got compression, you've got whether you can use all these products that are out there. But I think for me, the most important thing is that sleep. If you can get a good amount of sleep, when I noticed when I went from working full time to working part time, I'm getting an extra 2 hours a day. It's an absolute game changer.
Yeah. Also, just a quick touch point. We've talked about money a bit and expenses in this. Sleep costs you nothing.
Exactly, that is true.
a sports massage might cost you 30 to 50 quid. An extra hour in bed.
It actually probably costs you less, because if you sleep longer, you then don't have to eat as much throughout the day. So
Yeah, you still need to eat
I
enough.
know, I know.
But yeah, you're exactly right. Cost effectiveness of recovery. If there's people out there buying all sorts of gimmicks and stuff to try and make themselves better, I guarantee sleep is way more cost effective.
Agreed.
I was just going to introduce the last subject, but you can.
Yeah, so we have touched on marathon race day, and I think this leads into carbohydrate loading, which is like a race day topic or a big session topic. Carbohydrate loading is about changing our dietary composition to enable more storage of glycogen or maximize our glycogen storage, which is our carbohydrate storage, to put us in a better position for a hard training session or race day. If this was you, how would you do it, Matt? And I guess when would you do it? I've already explained that a bit.
Yeah, well, we spoke about the 500 grams and 2,000 calories of carbs, but the whole idea of carbohydrate loading is that you store a bit more than that. So you're starting with slightly higher endogenous stores. Obviously, you're going to be fueling as well. So, the two kind of go hand in hand to just give you a bigger sort of level of endogenous stored carbohydrate. Me personally, I wouldn't do it too often. As a strategy, I would do it for the race. I would probably, again, like we've said, I wouldn't want to turn up on marathon day having not practiced. So maybe when you're doing a bigger, longer run, you can practice that whole strategy just to check you feel good on it, because it can leave your legs feeling quite heavy.
Yeah.
And you need to accept that for the first few miles your legs are going to feel heavy, and then you're going to just start feeling better and better as the event goes on. But yeah, I would say fairly infrequently. You're probably best to talk about it, Cav, but I mean, or both of you, but as we know that athletes are eating a lot of carbs continually anyway, so you could almost argue that we're constantly carb loading, which I'm going to let you talk about that. But yeah, I'm going to let you talk about that. There we go.
Yeah, so as we've covered, Dan, you do a lot of training.
Yeah.
Pretty insane, really. But imagine most of your training days look like a lot of our recreational. Well, a lot of your training days look like my race days.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
Yeah.
So if you want to just put out as a bit of an example, like the sheer volume of food you may be eating after a session, which I guess we would describe to the average person as a carbohydrate load.
Yeah, I mean, there's a running joke in my house. Every time we make dinner, my missus always says to me, she says, "What are we carb loading for?" Because of the amount of just like, it always seems to be the same pastas, rices, breads, that sort of thing. And I think when you are doing that amount of training, like I can consistently do somewhere between 3 and 6 hours a day, you need to be able to have the carbohydrate stores, and the only way to do that is to be able to eat a high amount of carbohydrates. So yeah, it's
you're constantly loading.
Yeah, and obviously when you come to like race day, there are some little tweaks as to what you do. You might take on a little bit more. You might sort of throughout the day, rather than like I'm quite a big snacker in terms of I'll snack quite a lot, and rather than sort of snacking on higher protein stuff, it might be snacking on higher carbohydrate stuff throughout the day, just to sort of top up the carbohydrate stores. I mean, it's probably a totally different podcast as well, but I think something like caffeine has a big effect when it comes to race day as well.
Yeah.
But obviously, making sure you've got that carbohydrate load on when you're like pre-race. And the biggest tip from me would be just keep it as simple as you can. Don't try something you wouldn't, like we said, you wouldn't try new trainers, you wouldn't try new nutrition. Why would you try a new food or new carb load strategy the day before a race?
Yeah.
Something that I alluded to there, which I'm not sure I actually explained, is talking about Dan's hard training and depleting his glycogen stores, his carbohydrate stores. There's a bit of a tips and tricks, 4 bullet points that we're going to cover, and we're releasing with our article, which will be on the same topic as this, is tips and tricks for carb loading. So we recommend changing your dietary composition to around 80% carbohydrates. In the 24 hours pre-event, we recommend 8 to 12 grams per kilo. the 8 grams per kilo in the 24 hours before will be more recreational end, and the 12 grams per kilo will be more aligned with you, Dan. And also, I alluded to the fact that Dan was depleting his glycogen stores. There's research to suggest that after a good warm-up, a 3-minute exhaustive effort prepares your body to like hypercompensate how much carbohydrate you can store. So doing this 3-minute exhaustive effort will actually increase your maximum amount, and therefore you'll be able to store even more carbohydrates than you normally would. And hence I alluded to Dan's training being effectively a carb load every day. So yeah.
Yeah, so the only thing, that was the Australian Institute of Sport came up with that protocol. It's about 24 hours before your event is to do a 3-minute hard effort and then consume carbo load from there. The only thing I wanted to add to this whole discussion was athletes are carb loading constantly. I think the big difference, in my opinion, is that you're also tapering for an event. So you're taking on an enormous amount of carbohydrate when you're not requiring to burn it.
Yeah.
And I think that probably, if there's a way of describing carb loading over a high carb diet, it's just the fact that you've got this taper, you're doing less, you don't need this carbohydrate, and then with doing that 3-minute bout and taking the large amount of carbohydrate on, you do store a lot more. Whereas when you're constantly training, you're storing what you can, but you're not getting that sort of that extra little bit that you're getting from that particular protocol.
No, I agree.
But like we said, definitely practice before a long run so that you know that you're going to go well off it, because it's all about confidence, isn't it? You know, going into your marathon, just saying, this is how I'm going to fuel, this is what I'm going to take with me, this is what I'm going to eat the night before, this is what I'm going to have for breakfast. You know, all of that matters. We've spoken a lot, and I think that probably brings us to a close of our podcast, our first podcast. Hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll enjoy the future ones too.
Yeah. Thanks for coming along, Dan.
Yeah, no problem. It's good to be here, and it's obviously nice to talk about these sorts of things, to be honest.
It's been really interesting for, I think, all of us. So thank you very much.
No problem.